Welcome everyone to another installment of BigTentUSA's Spotlight Speaker Series. We're excited to have such an incredible turnout. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jill Saporin, a BigTent board member, and I'm delighted to host today's discussion with Applebaum and Katie Couric. While the world around us certainly feels chaotic, BigTentUSA remains committed to defending the democratic values and processes found in our Constitution. BigTent's goal is to empower you with facts and guidance and calls to action so you can become a stronger, more effective advocate. As we do our work, we urge you to use the knowledge you gain from our guests like today's and speak out. Those are the marching orders we are hearing from so many right now. Use your voice, remind lawmakers and those around you that the power of lawmaking belongs to Congress, not to individuals. Now I am thrilled to introduce you to our guests. We welcome back Anne Applebaum, a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who has authored several books, including best-selling Twilight of Democracy and her newest book, Autocracy, Inc. Anne is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and she co-directs a program focused on disinformation and propaganda. And BigTent friend, Katie Couric is an award-winning journalist and a #1 New York Times best-selling author, the first woman to solo anchor a network evening newscast, which I remember well. Katie served as anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News from 2006 to 2011, following 15 years on The Today Show. 8 years ago, she founded Katie Couric Media, which produces a daily newsletter, Wake Up Call, and the podcast Next Question. So this conversation is so on point today. Let's dive in. I'm handing it over to you, Katie.
All right, Jill, thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be with you and thrilled to be talking with Anne Applebaum, who is an incredibly smart, perceptive, insightful writer and interview subject. So, Anne, thank you so much for doing this because I think everyone is on edge. And before we talk about what's happening in this country, I thought you could give us some global perspective because we see autocracies popping up all over the world. And in fact, that is one of the topics you deal with, or the topics that you deal with in Autocracy, the dictators who want to run the world. Can you tell us what is happening around the world? What circumstances have presented themselves to make these various countries right for autocrats?
So first of all, thank you. I'm also delighted to be here back with all of you guys. It's really a pleasure always to be with people who are engaged and who interested and who want to do something with things that they learn. And I know that we'll get to that in the conversation. I mean, I'll just say a couple of words about my latest book because it is relevant to the U.S. and our situation. Essentially what I describe in my book is the way in which very different kinds of dictatorships, so nationalist Russia and communist China and theocratic Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, which really don't have anything to do with each other culturally or ideologically or in any other way, have begun to cooperate and collaborate. And there are many different ways in which they do this, but one of the primary reasons why they do it is that they came at some point over the past decade to perceive the language of democracy, the language of rights, the language of rule of law, the language of transparency, accountability. They came to see that language as threatening to them. All of these are states who rule, either they're ruling parties or individual leaders who rule without checks and balances, without an opposition, without independent media, without independent courts, and they want to keep it that way. And very often their own opposition parties, whether it's the Hong Kong Democrats or the Navalny movement in Russia, or the Iranian women's movement, were challenging them using the language of rights. And so they began to push back both by shoring one another up, keeping one another in power, through a series of financial deals. They're big users of the invisible alternate economy, the one based offshore, the one that uses shell companies and anonymous transactions. They look for ways to preserve and hide their money from sanctions. They also began to cooperate militarily. We saw this in Ukraine, where the North Koreans have sent soldiers and the Iranians have sent drones, to the front line in Europe. And we also see them collaborating, and this is maybe where this group has seen it in their own lives. You know, we also see them collaborating on authoritarian narratives. You know, more or less the idea that authoritarianism is stable and safe, and democracies are weak and divided, and authoritarians defend some kind of traditional definition of the family and of society, and democracies are degenerate. And some of their language has been taken up by people who live in democracies and repeated and amplified, and then they in turn have also helped amplify it. And some of their financial practices, you know, the kleptocracy, secrecy, you know, the youth kind of grand scale corruption has also been envied and imitated by people in the democratic world. And so the book is just a description of how that came to be and how those countries work together. But I very much see what's happening in our country as connected to that story.
Well, I was going to say, can you talk about that? Because some of the things you're saying are eerily, you know, reminding us of some of the things that we see happening here in the United States. And can you talk about that and how you see evidence of that?
I mean, some of what's happening in the United States has been happening for a long time. And so it's not as if Trump won the election and in 3 weeks has changed everything. The decline of, I mean, values is actually the wrong word, but I mean, the deterioration of democratic behaviors and the growth of autocratic behaviors has been happening in our country also for a decade. And so again, the consolidation of forms of authoritarian propaganda, the use of divisive and polarizing language that smears people. I mean, during our election campaign, you know, Donald Trump was talking about Americans as vermin, you know, as people who are poisoning the blood of the nation. I mean, that was about immigrants, but not only. The implication was anybody, you know, non-American people who live in America. He talked about his political opponents as enemies of the state or enemies of the people. I mean, this is language that has been used by autocrats in the past, and it's clear that a lot of Americans accepted it or ignored it or weren't bothered by it. And that was already, you know, that's already a sign, you know, a sign of change. I would also say that the growth of anonymity in our politics and in our economy, the fact that we don't really know who funds our election campaigns because of the dark money that goes into PACs. I mean, I'm sure you've had other sessions that discuss this. That's also, that's a, you know, anonymity and secrecy are hallmarks also of the authoritarian world. So some of this has been building here for a long time. But I would also say that this language of, you know, disrespect for courts, the idea that there's no such thing as independent media, the disrespect for civil servants, the idea that civil servants are somehow the enemy and they need to be, you know, the civil service ethos that was built up in the United States over the last century actually dates from the late 19th century, Theodore Roosevelt's civil service reforms, the idea that they need to be replaced by a politicized bureaucracy. I mean, these are all ideas that are borrowed from both the authoritarian world and what I would describe as the illiberal world. Maybe it's important to understand that nowadays, most democracies fail. When they fail, it's not because of a coup d'etat. It's not because like the military marches into the street and some colonels like shoot up the presidential palace. That's not what happens. What happens is that elected leaders who are legitimately elected assault their own institutions and change the rules to make it harder for anybody else to win and to give themselves extraneous more power. And that's what happened in Venezuela, and that's what happened in Turkey, and that's what happened in Hungary, and that's what's happening in India. And as you see from just the names of the countries, it's not a right-wing or a left-wing process, or it doesn't have to be. But it does depend on polarization. It does depend on one party or leader defining themselves as the true people. You know, we are the only real Americans, or we're the real Hungarians, or we're the real Turks, and everybody else are vermin, or they're traitors, or they're foreigners, or they're elites. And once you have that kind of talk in politics, then of course, you know, the party of the true people deserves to rule all the time because the other parties doesn't have status or doesn't have standing. And this kind of change we've seen coming in US politics for a long time.
Well, you've given me so much to unpack. I know that in your book, you write many of the propagandists of Autocracy Inc. have learned from the mistakes of the 20th century. They don't offer their fellow citizens a vision of utopia, and they don't inspire them to build a better world. Instead, they teach people to be cynical and passive because there is no better world to build. The reality is, though, that we're actually living in a time of general prosperity. Why are so many Americans falling prey to these cynical appeals that there is no better world to build? Is it because of an income inequality? I mean, what are the factors that are giving people so much reason to be aggrieved?
So I think inequality is a big piece of it. I mean, there is a sense that the economy is rigged. You know, the American dream is dead. Some people have captured all the money and all the power, and nobody else can, can take it. I don't think that explains all of it, because quite a lot of very wealthy people and very well-off people and very successful people who have themselves made progress in life also seem to be, and this is not just in the US, also seem to be susceptible to that kind of cynicism.
But is that because of taxation, Anne? They don't want to pay higher taxes, and they're he's going to make the rich get richer?
Maybe. I mean, I think there's more to it than that. I mean, I think I mean, my guess is that this is related both to the nature of social media, which now presents us information in ever-changing, rapid form. It's very hard to know what's important and what's not. When you're overwhelmed by information, you tend to say, I don't believe anything, it's all, I don't know what's true and what's not true. I think that's a piece of the story, but I think that's connected to something else, which is that we're living in a moment of really, really rapid change. Maybe we don't even acknowledge it, economic change and political change and demographic change and social change. And that there is a proportion of the population for whom that experience of rapid change is very, very unnerving. And
Right.
there's one thing that is true. So if you were born in, I don't know, rural or small town America, or indeed small town Poland or, rural France, 50 years ago, the world that you knew when you were growing up has completely disappeared. So you don't maybe everybody went to church in your town, or everybody went to the same school, or everybody, and that has created this sense of loss and nostalgia.
And by the way, there were people in your town. Now everyone's leaving rural America to go to big cities. So those towns are dying.
That's a part of it. I mean, it's, although once again, that doesn't explain the wealthy people in New York who feel this way. So it's
right.
Some of it is imaginary as well. I mean, some of it is just there is a sense that, I didn't grow up in a small town. I grew up in a city, but even so, the kind of childhood I had is also gone. I mean, we didn't have phones, and we didn't have, an onslaught of information, and we didn't have Instagram. And I mean, there is a way in which the speed of change and the sense of loss, I think, is really strong. I mean, that's a kind of more, maybe it's a deeper answer than you want, but
no, I know what you mean.
I'm not sure all of it is about, people like the economic explanation because that suggests there's a policy change that could fix it. But I mean, among other things, I think the Biden administration really did seek to do that. There was a lot of policies that were, they pursued with the idea that they were helping people who were on the lower end of the economic scale, and it backfired. I mean, it didn't work for them. And that makes me think that that's not the full explanation.
Yeah, I'm sure it's multifaceted. And I was just going to say, my daughter, who's 33, often says to me, Mom, I wish I grew up in the 70s, because she hates all the technology and the constant social media. And so I do think there's a nostalgia for a simpler way of life in many quarters that shouldn't be mistaken for the MAGA movement. But I think it's something that a lot of people share. I want to dig into what we've been witnessing these last few weeks. There's so much to cover. And that seems to be a part of the strategy. You know, they are aggressively flooding the zone, per Steve Bannon, you know, with a dizzying stream of executive orders and confounding announcements, from remaking Gaza to the Riviera, the Middle East, to taking over the Kennedy Center, to calling it the Gulf of America, to, I mean, there are almost too many to name. So I'm just curious, is this strategy of muzzle velocity that Steve Bannon talks about typical for a would-be autocratic leader? And is this something that you've seen in other places, or is this a new and unique approach to the Trump administration?
This is absolutely standard practice. I think, I mean, Putin invented it, and maybe he didn't invent it, but he was the great practitioner of it. And you know, he would, you know, when bad events happened, he perfected this technique, for example, of putting out hundreds and hundreds of different explanations, so many that people would say, well, we have no idea what happened. This was a famous thing that happened when if you remember the plane crash in eastern Ukraine in 2014, the Malaysian airliner, you know, there was just this tsunami of information about it, all false. And that was designed to disguise reality. But also the putting out of multiple policies, and which is part of another process, which is commanding constant attention. This is something we definitely have seen before. So Hugo Chavez, you know, also legitimately elected leader when he first came into office, practiced exactly this. I mean, Chavez actually had a Sunday television program where he would appear for hours and hours and hours, and he would invite celebrities on, and sometimes he would sing and so on. You know, I mean, it was a kind of political entertainment show. He ran that, and that was just him on TV, and he constantly sought to dominate the news and the airwaves all the time. And that was part of what you do when you do that, is you eliminate the idea that there's an alternative. You know, you make your opponents seem absent. Like, you know, and you can hear this in the US in the last few years, like, where are the Democrats? And the answer is they're there, and some of them are saying things, and you know, there are
But
things
they can't
happening,
get any airtime.
but you're not hearing them. You know, and that's because the success that you know, that the system have dominated. I mean, there are others. You know, Lopez Obrador, the previous president of Mexico, used to run, who had very autocratic tendencies, and actually also did a lot of damage to the Mexican civil service and other Mexican institutions. He had this morning press conference that would go on for, you know, hours, and he would have, you know, moments of hate where he would feature his enemies and so on. So this is a very, very common tactic, you know,
Interesting.
dominate the airwaves, gather attention, eliminate your opponents, make it seem like they're not there. All of that, the point of that is to, you know, is to bulldoze through, you know, changes to the political system.
And I think that leaves journalists wondering, how do they cover Trump? And this is something that they worried about in 2016 and the election leading up to his first go round. And in other autocracies or developing autocracies, you know, what is the role of journalism and the media writ large in terms of aiding and abetting this? And have journalists been able to counteract sort of these movements in any effective way?
I mean, you know, the idea that journalists are the opposition is of course always mistaken. You know, the opposition is, you know, you guys. The opposition is the citizens and their elected representatives. You know, there is obviously a role for journalism in exposing and explaining what's happening, in conducting the investigative reporting that's going to be needed. I mean, you can already see there are big red flags. There's corruption kind of coming down the pike very fast. In fact, it's probably already with us. Well, I'm sure you'll want to talk about the role of Musk and the idea of
That's my next topic.
in a minute. But the, you know, and also I think, you know, it would be, you know, you know, the difficulty, as you've just said, is going to be explaining and informing people while at the same time allowing space for people to step back and put what's going on in a frame. I mean, it's not just shock horror, the president's going to build a Trump Tower in Gaza. You know, you need someone to put it in a frame and say, what does this mean in the Middle East? And, you know, how do people feel about it? And I think there is some journalism doing that. I mean, you know, although another piece of caution is that I don't think most Americans anymore get their information, their political information, from what you and I would call journalism. In other words, right-wing journalism or left-wing journalism, but people who've gone out and found information and are then presenting it either on TV or on the radio or in a newspaper or in an article. A lot of people now get their information from TikTok, from podcasts,
Their
from
Facebook page.
from their Facebook page, from their friends, and that's not necessarily journalism. That's rumors or and so the real question is, can people who want to communicate an alternative find a way to reach those people? Because it's not going to happen through journalism. Journalism is, it's what I do. I'm sitting right now in the offices of the Atlantic magazine. That's it behind me. When I'm here, what we talk about all day long is, what should we be covering? How do we cover it? How do we ration our resources to make sure that we're giving sufficient time to, to what's going on. But I don't think that's the only, we're not the only kind of information that's available. And for our politicians and maybe for activists, also beginning to think about other means of communication is just as important.
And it's really hard when we have a president who, started with fake news, and now it has become such an earworm for people where no one believes anyone, and then everyone's in their own silo. You say that we're not the opposition, but, Fox News is pretty much a propaganda tool of the Trump administration. They don't talk about bad things he does. They frame everything in a positive way. And so, I think if you actually report the facts, people consider you biased because you're telling the truth.
There's
things that are being done are against the law,
reality-based journalism feels to many people around Trump like bias.
Right.
And Trump, continues to repeat falsehoods every day. He said again in the interview he did at the time of the Super Bowl, he again said that he won the 2020 election, which is not true. He repeatedly says that over and over again. He makes false statements about Gaza, about Canada. He makes up statistics. Much of what's been said both by him and by Musk about USAID, the United States, our most important aid agency and one of our most important sources of soft power for 50 years, they've just been lying about it. And it's very hard to contradict that because they have status. He's the president, Trump is the president, and Musk is his effective prime minister. And, it can feel like contradicting them is difficult and dangerous.
And it's also hard.
They are repeatedly lying, every day. Yeah.
But having said that, there are programs at USAID that probably, the agency, like many, needed some reforms. I just read this big piece by Joni Ernst of Iowa. And of course, she is a big Trump supporter, but there are legitimate things that the agency was doing wrong. Right. But I think it was so colored. So I think what's hard is nobody can read something dialectically or approach something dialectically. They see it good or bad. They don't see it as nuanced.
So I think it's really important to be clear that the attack on USAID has nothing to do with whether USAID was good or bad, or whether it was, some of its programs were better or worse. That's a separate conversation that we could have legitimately had. Are there things that it does that we like and things that but that's not the conversation that we're having. So what's being done to USAID is they're using it as a kind of political and propaganda tool. They're showing,
and as a test case, right, Anne?
As a test case, they're showing that they can destroy an institution, and it's a congressionally mandated institution. All of its programs, whether you like them or you don't like them, were all congressionally mandated. Everything that they do, that institution did, came from some expression of will of an elected politician. They weren't making stuff up by themselves. If they were doing democracy promotion, that's because somebody wanted them to do that. If they were funding independent newspapers, that's because somebody wanted them to do that. If they were distributing food aid to refugees who would otherwise starve, which is one of the big things that they do, then somebody wanted them to do that. So everything that they were doing was congressionally mandated. And so the destruction of USAID is not a cost-saving measure. It's not about fighting fraud. That's all false. What it is doing is showing that Trump and Musk and Russell Vought, who's now going to be running the bureaucracy, that they are able to destroy an institution. And that, of course, is a message being sent to everybody else who works for the federal government saying that your institution can be destroyed too. And they've already hit another one. I mean, they hit this Consumer Protection Bureau for Financial Services.
Right.
They are talking about the Department of Education. They're talking about the Department of Labor. You know, there may be others. There may be pieces of other institutions that they want to destroy. Why they want to destroy them, we don't always know. You know, are these things that are they a problem for Musk's business, which may be the case? Are they, you know, are they something that they dislike ideologically? You know, or are they just seeking to create a climate of hostility and uncertainty around the federal service because they're trying to politicize the whole thing? And so take a step back. Like when people say, well, some of what USAID did was bad, that's fine. That's great. That's a totally different conversation.
Right.
One that we could have had, you know, 4 weeks ago, but it's
Right.
not the one that we're having. That's not what's happening.
And to your point, the right is kind of reframing it and using it as talking points, and a lot of them are not legitimate. And in fact, Samantha Power wrote this New York Times op-ed, "Killing USAID is a win for autocrats everywhere." And since you're an expert on autocracies, can you talk about why this is a really bad thing for for democracies around the world, and why it could feed into burgeoning autocracies?
So part of why so many countries, both our close allies, but also other countries in Africa and Asia and so on, both our closest allies and others, why they cooperate with the United States is because they admire the United States, because they feel that the United States stands for a set of values, because the United States expresses its generosity, for example, through help given to refugees, you know, who are, you know, the poorest people on the planet. The U.S. has a kind of very powerful, built up over many decades reputation, and not everybody agrees with this, and plenty of people think it's hypocritical. And those people are going to now have a field day and say, "We told you the United States was always it was all fake," and they didn't believe their own values. But quite a lot of people did believe that. And the reason why I'm just going to take a random, a country like, for example, Kenya might cooperate with the U.S. in fighting terrorism would be because, they see something that they want to be aligned with. They know that we do a lot of work, curing childhood diseases in Africa because we distribute polio vaccines. It's part of who we are and what we stand for. The USA, this expression soft power.
Right.
USAID was an important part of America's soft power. So we have guns and tanks and nasty diplomats, but we also have this other stuff that we do that people like and admire us for. And by cutting off that and saying we're not going to be that kind of power anymore, we're just a transactional power who we just do deals. That puts us on a par with Russia and China and with other autocratic states who don't have a who don't stand for anything else except transactions. And so it really is a very important, damaging to our reputation and standing. There are other arguments. The USAID is also very important for American farmers. It's
right.
It's been just quite apart from politics. There will be children who die within the coming days and weeks because USAID has withdrawn its food programs and from children who are being malnourished, and they will die very soon. And so there's also a level of cruelty and immorality in this policy that I think may also be on purpose. They want whatever is our worst instincts, our instinct to ignore people and not care about people and, not care who lives and who dies. And they're trying to encourage that as well.
Let's talk about Elon Musk. Our time goes so fast, and we want to talk about Elon Musk and the impact he's having, and it's huge, obviously. And you know, I interviewed Edward Luce from the Financial Times recently about Musk's maternal family's affiliation with the Canadian Nazi Party, family legacy he has not repudiated. We talked about his going to, appearing at Germany's far right AfD event, telling people that children should not be guilty of the sins of their parents, let alone their great grandparents. There's too much focus on past guilt. We need to move beyond that. I mean, talk about sort of, I don't think it's easy to get into Elon Musk's head, but can you talk about sort of how he's approaching things and his background and why we really need to take this incredibly seriously?
So I think it's important just first say that what Musk is and what he's doing now is totally unprecedented in American history. So we don't have in the United States a tradition of unelected and even unappointed. I mean, there have been very wealthy people in cabinets before, including, FDR's cabinet. I mean, it's not unusual. There have been businessmen in politics before. There are businessmen who influence politics or who influence decisions. That's normal. I mean, that's what happens in any country. But to have somebody who doesn't have a government job, a real government job, to be actually making decisions about what payments are made and not paid and made, including decisions that could affect his own companies. So somebody who has an enormous, does an enormous business with the US government. Both Starlink and Tesla and many of his other companies have huge Pentagon contracts and relationships with the federal government. To have someone like that making decisions that will directly affect him, and directly affect, particular aspects of his companies. This is unprecedented, and this is much more like the role that an oligarch plays in Russia. So a Russian oligarch is somebody who has both political and economic power, at the same time, in ways that are unhealthy. They have money because they have political power, and vice versa. And to have Musk in that role is, as I said, I didn't know of I've been actually looking for precedents in American history, and I don't see a precise one. I have to assume that, like for anybody else, many different things motivate him. Some of it may be his own business interests. Some of it may be, actually that story about his family, who were a Canadian, grandfather was a Canadian Nazi who moved to South Africa. That was, I think, originally in the Atlantic. So that's fairly well known. I mean, he may also just have been, it looks to a lot of people who used to know him like he was radicalized on Twitter, that he spent a lot of time on Twitter reading far-right conspiracy theories, reading, the kind of nonsense that we were just talking about, and maybe believed it. I mean, what motivates him is much less interesting to me than what he's doing and the extraordinary illegality of it. I mean, there is no reason why he or random young engineers who work for him should have access to the US Treasury payment system or to the databases of any US, government departments or agencies. There are cybersecurity threats attached to that. There are political threats. There are economic threats. It's extraordinarily dangerous. And one of the things that is puzzling me at the moment is why the people who do know this, I mean, the Republicans in the Senate, for example, haven't made a decision to stop it.
Well, I want to move on and talk about checks and balances, because when it comes to Congress, that has the power of the purse, it seems like the check is in the mail. Why? Can you talk about the complicity of Republican lawmakers? And is that something you also witness in other autocracies?
So this is something I've written about. Actually, I wrote an article in 2020 that I based on a lot, many conversations, and also some history. I think The Atlantic is the only magazine on the planet that would have I started it with sort of like 1,000 words about two East Germans, but you have to read the article. It's called "History Will Judge the Complicit" or something like that. And one of this is, of course, something you see in other countries. And one of the lessons you learn when you look at history is that actually in history, most people collaborate. When I was working on that article, I went to see Marion Bertler, who's a former East German dissident. Later, she ran the Stasi archive, which was their secret police archive after the reunification of Germany. And I asked her this question. I said, well, let's talk about, who conformed and why. And she looked at me. She was like, what are you talking about? Everybody conformed. Once the rules of the system had been set up so that if you wanted a job and you wanted housing and you wanted your kid to go to university and you wanted your mother-in-law to get medicine at the hospital, then you did what the regime told you to do. And unfortunately, that will happen. I mean, when the rules change, and this is what could happen in the civil service, either you will conform to the rules and you will say what they tell you to say about whatever, about DEI or climate or, whatever they're using as their purity test or their loyalty test. If you don't conform, then you will be expelled. I mean, has always been harder for me to explain in the case of elected politicians, especially senators, because they're elected for 6 years. They have a lot of, power. Nobody can remove them. They are, what's the worst thing that could happen to them? The worst thing is they don't get reelected and then they have to teach at the Harvard Kennedy School. It's not like it's not like they're going to jail or, they'll be tortured or murdered if they don't do what Trump says. And yet we've even among that group of people, we see this extraordinary willingness to conform, to ignore the Constitution, to let Trump do what he wants, to confirm Trump's completely, off the rails, inappropriate cabinet nominations.
Yeah, I mean,
Off the rails.
Angus King, basically did a riff on what happened during the McCarthy hearings. Have you no decency? Is there no red line? And it doesn't seem like anything, save for Lisa Murkowski and Hegseth, right? I mean, it just doesn't seem like they're finding their conscience at all. And meanwhile, and then we'll get to what everyone can do, because somebody said this is not making us feel better.
No, I think some of it is genuine. I said they have no real fear. I mean, some of it, there is something in US politics, it's also been developing for a long time, that we didn't used to have, which is that a lot of them are personally intimidated. I mean, Mitt Romney wrote about this. If you're from a red state and you're a senator and you vote against Trump, then you will have death threats. You might have people standing outside your house. Your kids might be threatened. I mean, there is also
but we also saw during COVID, it may hurt your constituents, right? I mean, Gretchen Whitmer and all the games they played during COVID with PPE and all that stuff. I mean, it's not just you personally. It could be the people in your state that you're representing, right, Anne?
Yeah, there's many ominous things happening now. I mean, one of them is the attack on universities. There's been the NIH, which funds health research all over the country, actually, has announced huge cuts in federal funding, which is also, by the way, completely illegal. And one of the disturbing things is that there's some lawsuits that have just been filed. And they're coming from universities in blue states. And it's because the universities in red states, either their own, because particularly state universities, their attorney generals won't support them, or they're afraid, or maybe they're going to cut some kind of separate deal. But that's very creepy. I mean, in other words, this is something that hurts everybody. University of Alabama has a huge hospital in Birmingham, does a lot of research,
Right.
Vanderbilt. I mean, there are plenty of great universities in red states, great medical schools, great hospitals, and they are also having their funding cut, but they seem to be reluctant to join their, colleagues in protesting. So we see a lot of hedging already, not just among politicians, not just among civil servants, but you'll see there will be more stuff coming at universities, and then of course in the private sector we've seen plenty of that too. I'm sure you've talked about it on your other recent programs.
Yeah, like preemptive, measures out of fear. I wanted to ask you about the judiciary, because on Sunday, JD Vance wrote on X, quote, if a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the attorney general on how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges are not allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. This seems to be a real challenge to the judiciary branch of government. And I know that judges in Massachusetts and Rhode Island have pressed pause on some of the things the Trump administration is trying to do. So 2 questions, Anne. Are the courts strong enough to stop some of these things from happening? And what if the Trump administration ignores what the courts are saying?
So clearly Vance is wrong. I mean, what the judges are saying is that, the president's president does not have the power to block congressionally mandated programs for which funds have already been appropriated. In other words, this is against the Constitution. I am afraid that ignoring the judges is going to be the first really big constitutional crisis, and we're maybe hours away from it. And I don't know how it will be resolved, because what has made our political system work for the last couple hundred years, give or take the Civil War, has been the players in the tripartite system, the judiciary, the legislative and executive powers, understanding their roles and understanding what powers the other one has. Again, the judiciary is not telling President Trump what to do. It's just saying that you can't, you don't have the right, you don't have the authority to block programs that have been mandated by Congress. That's not part of what the president is that's not part of his powers as the powers of the executive in our system. And if the Trump administration decides to ignore that or surpass it, then we really are in another stage of crisis. And I don't know, I can't tell you now, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I can't tell you now exactly how it will be resolved, but it would be something that, depending on the scale of it, is something we haven't seen. I mean, I guess the last version of this was southern states ignoring segregation decisions, back in the 50s. I mean, that's
Wasn't there
the last
something
time
with
something happened on that scale.
Yeah, and with Nixon, I think too, he tried to do something and it was quashed by Congress. I can't remember. Maybe it was impounding funds. I can't remember. Sorry.
Yeah, that was an argument. But actually, this is not just impoundment. This is the executive, or ignoring the courts or ignoring that. I don't know of an example of that at scale. Maybe you could find small versions of it, but I don't know of an example of that at scale recently.
Tell us, I know you've been traveling and you've been in Canada, obviously in Europe. What is the world talking about, witnessing what's happening here in our country?
So our allies are afraid, and they are, that's there are different reactions. I mean, in Canada, they're talking about we need to reorganize our economy so that we have LNG ports and we export our oil to Asia, and we have to be stopped so dependent on the United States. And, Europeans are, massively building new weapons. That people are adjusting, but mostly there's an element of this, especially of some of Trump's pronouncement, Gaza, Greenland, and so on. There's an element of it that's very Kafkaesque. Like, it's not clear, it's not clear why it's happening. It just seems to be his whim. People do these kind of post hoc explanations. They try to find geopolitical reasons, like why is Greenland important? But really, it might not be about that at all. It might just be a kind of thing he has in his head for some reason. And people are unused to thinking of the US president and a US administration behaving like that. Like, we think maybe we don't like the US, or maybe we're against their policy, but like there's a policy and there's a strategy and there's a policy process, and we understand it and we know who to talk to, inside the US administration. And people are worried that that's not true anymore. Can you is there anyone lower down in the administration with whom you could discuss Greenland? It's not clear, because it's not clear who's really making that policy.
Let me get to some questions from the BigTent community. Sorry, everyone, to get to you a little bit later. Historically, what have been the 3 most successful strategies in overturning authoritarianism?
I don't know about three. I mean, I can tell you I lived in Poland some of you know, maybe I lived there part of the time and for 20 years. And we had actually an autocratic populist government in power from 2015 to 2023. And there was some of this that's happening in the US is familiar to me. I mean, this kind of blizzard of changes. In their case, they tried to politicize the judiciary very fast and unconstitutionally. What happened was the creation of new coalitions. And so we eventually defeated them electorally. And it was thanks to a center-right, center-left kind of liberal coalition, a very broad one of people who don't agree about a lot of things, but agreed about constitutionalism and judicial independence, for example. There was also, one of the things that will happen, in our system, it happened there too, is that when you don't have oversight, when you don't have, access for the press, when you don't have transparency, you will get corruption. And there will be corruption pretty fast. And a lot of the opposition was able to kind of organize itself around that as a main issue. I mean, even though people disagreed about other things, they disagree about abortion or whatever, they disagree about housing policy, people agreed that, about corruption, and that turned out to be a very powerful argument to make back. I mean, remember, the United States is not a dictatorship in the sense that Russia is, and so let's not keep the analysis nuanced. I mean, we have a legitimate opposition, we have Democratic Party, we have courts, we have media. It's not like everything's shut down. And so finding ways for people to use those tools and come together, and to find the stories and the narratives and the arguments that unite people instead of dividing them. I mean, I think that's the best idea. I mean, there are a lot of stories from the autocratic world about mobilizing citizens and so on. And some of that, we're a democracy, but some of that might be applicable here too.
Well, I think people are wondering, someone in fact asked, is large-scale protest an effective against early stage authoritarianism? And, we haven't seen people take to the street. We haven't seen the Women's March. I think people feel overwhelmed in many cases, and they don't know the most effective way to fight back. I mean, one of the most commented things I'm seeing in the chat is people feel powerless. They don't know what to do. Is there more than calling your, representatives, which I've done, and members of Congress and local offices, et cetera? What else?
Marches, I have some ambivalent feelings about them. I mean, they do help in that they give people, and this is not a small thing. They give people the sense of empowerment. I mean, I was in a lot of marches in Poland at that time, and they being with 1 million people on a street is great, and they all, and I think we may eventually get to that. They aren't necessarily effective in changing policy, but they have other uses. They mobilize people. They persuade people they energize people and persuade them to go and do things. And so I would hope that we would see marches at the state level. I mean, I'm kind of less.
Someone just pointed out there were marches last Wednesday in all 50 states.
I saw that. I mean, they were fairly small, but
right.
What would be useful would be, focusing on that. I mean, focusing on state capitals. And
more media attention of those protests.
And using the marches and using any protest you do to remind your state representatives, both your members of Congress and your state house, the people who represent you at the state level, reminding them of what you think and I think beginning to find the stories and that demonstrate the damage being done. And again, whether it's your hospital in Birmingham or whether it's the Head Start program that's being cut, or whether it's the stories of people who were saved from fraud by the Financial Protection Bureau that's now been destroyed. I mean, finding the pieces of the story that you can tell your legislators and you can tell other people. I mean, that's something that citizens can do. A member of Congress said this to somebody, I had an email exchange with somebody who said that her member of Congress had said to her, bring me stories, like show me what's happening, talking to people at the level of democracy, judges, and so on. I mean, of course we have to do that, but what will really convince people and begin to build the coalition that we need is the very specific stories of things that you see on the ground, people that you know, things that are happening in your community. The more you can communicate that to the people who represent you. I mean, one of the things that's happened in the United States also over the last few decades has been the decline of participation in local politics. Actually,
And also the decline in local news, which is
so actually a lot of political decisions are made at the state level, a lot of the most important decisions. And reminding your state representatives and knowing who they are and communicating with them, as well as communicating obviously with your members of Congress. This is really important. And to the extent that you are able to be, I know people have limits on their time and I understand that, but you're able to be involved in state level politics as a campaigner or participant or a fund or whatever it is that you're able to do. I mean, that's a really, really important part of American life that's been partly lost.
And what do you think Democrats should be doing that they're not doing, or what are they doing right, or what can they do? They are the minority, got Republican controlled everything right now. What do you think Democrats can do that could be more effective in pushing back and challenging all these?
I'd like to see them speaking with one voice. I'm just using some of the same language, telling these stories themselves. I would also like to see them using those different channels of social media and other, non-traditional media to reach constituents who can't be reached. I mean, there are also, I mean, the budget negotiations coming up will be a really important moment for Democrats to demonstrate unity and to show that they have they have an alternative program. I actually liked Tim Snyder's idea of, if those of you who follow him, of creating a kind of shadow cabinet. In other words, a group of people who are, someone who can speak to healthcare, someone who can speak to whatever housing policy, people on the in Congress or who are the go-to people on particular issues. I mean, one of the problems of our system is that it's very diffuse. I mean, there are lots of members of Congress, they say different things. I mean, if it was clear that the Democratic Party had a spokesman for healthcare and it was, or a spokesman for transportation, that would be of enormous help. I mean, just thinking in a more organized way about what it means to be an opposition in this system, I'd really like to see that too.
And feeling more coherent, and as you said, one voice, and maybe, having it on all their social media channels, like an issue of the day. I don't know, something. It just feels like it is so fragmented in an already fragmented media ecosystem. I wanted to ask you quickly about history. You write about Stalin and how one of his first moves was firing all the government employees. I keep reading, and some people have mentioned in the chat that Hitler changed Germany in 53 days, and I'm wondering if you can see parallels from the way those dictators operated and the things that Donald Trump and his administration and his crony Elon Musk are doing.
So I don't think we need to even go to Hitler and Stalin. I mean, we can say that any illiberal leader, elected leader, who is seeking to change the political system, the first thing they do is attack the civil service. And we have in our country, maybe people don't know the history, but we had in the 19th century a system of so-called patronage. That meant that civil servants were hired and fired by the president. They were only loyal to the president. It was a system that was profoundly corrupt. It was inefficient. People's cousins got jobs just because they were cousins or party members. That was changed partly by Theodore Roosevelt before he was president. He was a civil service reformer. That was changed at the end of the 19th century. And, doesn't mean that everybody who works in our civil service is nice or good or efficient, but we had a structure and an ethos of civil service in which the civil servants were loyal to the Constitution. They were not supposed to be partisan. They took a direction from Democratic or Republican presidents. They were hired and fired based on a system of, expertise and performance rating and so on, at least in theory. If you worked in the EPA, it was because you knew about pollution, right? And it wasn't because you were the cousin of the president. If you worked in the labor statistics, it's because you were a statistician and not because you were some friend of a friend, and that, And that was the system that that made America prosperous, because we had more or less, nonpartisan. We had a professional civil service. Once we don't have that anymore, we've reverted to patronage, and civil servants are only loyal to the person who, to the president. Then we have things like, okay, you're the head of the IRS. The president tells you he wants you to go after one of his enemies, and you do it. I mean, because you're working for him, you're not working for the American people, or you work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and someone says inflation is too high, we don't want to see those numbers, make them lower. You do it,
Right.
and we have false statistics. And so it is something that anybody who wants to, make the state more illiberal, more loyal to an individual rather than to the country, that's the first thing that they do.
I hate to ask this question, but it's a good one. If the weekend polls are accurate, the majority of Americans polled approve of Trump's actions so far. Without the broad support of Americans, what chance do we have of saving our democracy?
I don't think it's huge majorities. I mean, remember that a lot of people like the feeling that something is happening. And this was something that the Biden administration didn't understand. And so, this whirlwind of change, is attractive to a lot of people who are watching. Unfortunately, national politics has a soap opera, Netflix series element to it, which is why actually local politics is better. And, people like that. I mean, I do think that once the changes reach people, and once the stories of damage reach people, if that's what happens, then you'll begin to see a change. Remember, it's just been a couple weeks. And Trump won the election, and people in our country feel that, he won. He's, it's not the moment to question him. I mean, in 2016, he won, but he didn't win the popular vote. There were a lot of weird things about the election. People were uncomfortable with, so this time it didn't feel like that. It felt like he won. And so I think it'll be some time before you see opposition. And also remember that the things that bother you guys, again, democracy, politicized courts, some of that is, and we also learned this in Poland. Some of that is language that doesn't move people. People are moved by stories. They're moved by personal experiences. They're not as moved by theory. We're still it's a lot is happening, but we're still at the moment when the change is theoretical, right? And until it's real, it'll be hard to mobilize people, I think.
Gosh, I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we are. We want to thank you, Anne, for your expertise. So many people in the chat are saying how much they admire you and your writing and what you do. So we really want to thank you for coming. Katie, we always enjoy having you here with us. And as Anne said, there are some things we can do, like speaking out and talking to your lawmakers and participating in state politics. So those are things to think about as these days go on. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.